Between 1850 and 1920, cattle ranchers had 30 desserts that made frontier life bearable. Bear sign, sourdough donuts, and molasses candy. These weren't fancy creations. They were survival desserts made from flour, lard, molasses, and wild berries growing nearby. Then the 1950 arrived. Store-bought cookies replaced the Dutch oven bear sign. Today, nobody remembers. These are the 30 forgotten rancher desserts no one makes anymore. Cowboys called them bear sign because the dough dropped into hot lard resembled bear tracks in mud, and they rode 20 miles just to taste them fresh from Dutch ovens. These weren't delicate bakery donuts requiring precision and patience. They were rough fried bread balls made from sourdough starter, flour, sugar, and whatever lard the cook had saved from breakfast bacon. The dough got dropped by spoonfuls into bubbling fat over campfires, fried until golden, then rolled in sugar or dripped with molasses while still hot. Each batch cost pennies and fed dozens of hungry ranch hands who considered them luxury food worth fighting over. Cookie, the cattle drive cook, made bear sign on paydays and special occasions when morale needed boosting after weeks of eating beans and hardtack. The smell of frying dough traveled miles across prairies, and cowboys claimed they could smell bear sign before they saw camp. By 1940, nobody called donuts bear sign anymore, and the Dutch oven tradition died with the last trail drives. Ranchers kept sourdough starter alive like family heirlooms because it meant donuts could happen anytime flour and lard existed together in the same kitchen. The starter lived in crocks near warm stoves, fed weekly with flour and water, passed down through generations of ranch families who understood that good starter meant good donuts meant happy cowboys. Making them required mixing starter with flour, sugar, and melted lard into sticky dough that rested overnight before cutting into rounds and frying in hot fat until puffy and golden. The tangy sourdough flavor distinguished them from regular donuts, and the texture stayed softer longer than yeast versions that hardened within hours. Ranch wives made dozens every Saturday morning, and they disappeared before noon as hired hands grabbed them between chores. The donuts cost almost nothing because starter was free, flour was cheap, and lard came from butchering hogs. By 1950, packaged yeast replaced sourdough starter in most ranch kitchens, and the tradition of keeping starter alive died when convenience won over flavor, and nobody had time for weekly feeding schedules anymore. Pulling molasses candy was entertainment and dessert combined when ranchers gathered for barn raisings and winter socials that required occupying restless children. The recipe couldn't have been simpler because it required only molasses, butter, and vinegar boiled together until it reached hard crack stage, then poured onto buttered plates to cool until barely handleable. Ranch families pulled the warm candy between buttered hands, stretching it repeatedly until it turned from dark brown to golden tan and developed the chewy texture that made it worth the hour-making effort. Children competed over who could pull longest strands, and adults remembered their own childhood candy pulls decades later. The candy kept for months in tins without spoiling, making it perfect for storing through long winters when fresh desserts were impossible. Cowboys carried pieces in saddlebags during long rides, and the sugar provided quick energy during exhausting cattle drives. One batch cost 15 cents and produced enough candy to fill multiple tins that families rationed carefully. By 1960, store-bought candy replaced homemade versions, and nobody had patience for pulling molasses anymore.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Sorghum syrup came from cane mills on homesteads, and ranchers turned it into taffy during autumn harvest celebrations, when fresh-pressed syrup flowed abundantly, and celebration was required after brutal harvest work. Making taffy meant boiling sorghum with butter until it reached the right temperature, pouring it onto marble slabs or greased pans, then pulling it repeatedly until it lightened in color and achieved the perfect chewy consistency that stuck to teeth but didn't break them. Ranch children loved taffy pulls because they got to help, and the activity kept them occupied for hours while adults finished harvest chores. The golden brown taffy tasted distinctly different from molasses candy because sorghum had milder, almost grassy sweetness that some people preferred over molasses' bitter edge. Each batch cost almost nothing because ranchers grew their own sorghum cane and pressed their own syrup during fall harvests. Cowboys received taffy pieces as Christmas gifts, and they lasted through entire winters without spoiling. By 1955, corn syrup replaced sorghum in most recipes, and taffy pulls became old-fashioned activities nobody remembered. These enormous molasses cookies earned their name from resembling frogs sunning on lily pads, and ranchers loved them because they stayed soft for weeks in saddlebags during long cattle drives without crumbling into dust. The recipe came from New England fishing villages, but traveled west with settlers who needed cookies that survived harsh conditions and tasted good even after weeks of storage. Making them required molasses, brown sugar, flour, ginger, and rum or water mixed into stiff dough that rolled out thick and cut into huge circles measuring 5 inches across. Each cookie weighed several ounces and provided substantial energy for cowboys working 16-hour days. The molasses and spices improved with age, and cookies tasted better after a week than fresh from ovens. Ranch wives baked hundreds at once because they kept so well, and cowboys traded them like currency during cattle drives. One batch cost 20 cents and produced 24 giant cookies that fed multiple ranch hands multiple times. By 1950, smaller cookies replaced these giants, and nobody made 5-inch cookies anymore. 5 ranch desserts down, 25 more waiting in forgotten recipe boxes and old cowboy memories. Number 7 uses wild cherries nobody picks anymore. Number 11 grows on remote mountain slopes. Number 15 cooks in skillets over campfires. These weren't just desserts, they were survival strategies when sugar and flour were luxuries. Butter was expensive and spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so ranchers made cookies with lard that cost pennies and lasted indefinitely in root cellars and pantries without going rancid. The cookies tasted surprisingly delicate despite their humble fat source because lard created a tender crumb that butter couldn't match, and nobody complained about lard when cookies melted on tongues. Ranch wives mixed lard with sugar, eggs, vanilla, and flour into simple dough that was dropped by spoonfuls onto greased pans and baked into plain rounds that satisfied sweet cravings without pretending to be fancy. Children ate them after school with fresh milk, and cowboys grabbed handfuls between morning and afternoon chores. The cookies cost almost nothing because lard came from butchering hogs every fall, and ranchers rendered their own fat rather than buying expensive butter from town stores. Each batch produced 6 dozen cookies that were stored for weeks in covered crocks. Chokecherries grew wild across prairies and foothills, and ranchers picked them by the bucketful during late summer when the tiny dark berries hung heavy on bushes, and free food meant survival through lean winters. The berries tasted astringent, raw, puckering mouths and earning their choking name, but cooking with sugar transformed them into fillings so rich and flavorful that cowboys requested chokecherry pie over any other dessert. Making pie required pitting hundreds of tiny cherries by hand, mixing them with sugar and cornstarch, pouring everything into lard crust, and baking until bubbling purple juice stained oven floors. The labor was worth it because one pie cost nothing except time and sugar, and the flavor resembled expensive cherry pie that ranchers couldn't afford buying. Ranch families put up quarts of choke cherry filling every August, ensuring pie availability through winter months when fresh fruit didn't exist. By 1970, fewer people recognized choke cherry bushes, and the tradition of picking wild fruit died when supermarket produce became affordable and convenient enough to eliminate foraging necessity completely. Wild grapevines climbed fence posts and cottonwood trees across ranch properties, producing clusters of small tart grapes that ranchers harvested every September for pies that tasted nothing like store-bought grape anything. The grapes were smaller than cultivated varieties, more sour, more intensely flavored, and required significant sugar to become palatable in desserts. Ranch wives picked grapes by the dishpan, removed them from stems, cooked them briefly to release juices, then strained out seeds and skins before mixing grape pulp with sugar and thickening it into filling. The resulting pie filling was deep purple, intensely grape-flavored, and completely unlike the artificially flavored grape products that would dominate later decades. Each pie cost pennies because grapes were free and sugar was cheap, and the flavor satisfied people who never tasted fresh grapes from stores. Cowboys requested wild grape pie during fall roundups when grapes ripened, and ranch cooks obliged because ingredients cost nothing. By 1965, wild grapevines got cleared during fence repairs, and nobody picked wild grapes when stores sold cultivated varieties year-round. Juneberries ripened in midsummer across northern prairies, and ranchers picked them eagerly because the sweet purple berries tasted like blueberries mixed with cherries and made pies that impressed guests despite costing nothing. The berries grew on shrubs that dotted hillsides and creek bottoms, producing abundant crops that fed birds and humans equally, until ranchers picked them clean every June. Making pie required filling buckets with berries that stained fingers purple, mixing them with sugar and flour, pouring everything into pie crusts, and baking until juice bubbled through vents cut in top crusts. The flavor was unique and unforgettable, milder than choke cherries but more complex than regular blueberries. Ranch families picked enough berries to make dozens of pies that got eaten fresh or frozen for winter consumption. Cowboys loved Juneberry pie more than most desserts because the flavor reminded them of summer during brutal winter months. Each pie cost only sugar and labor because berries were free. By 1975, Juneberry shrubs got bulldozed during land clearing, and younger generations never tasted the berries their grandparents considered superior to any cultivated fruit. Fresh peaches spoiled within days without refrigeration, so ranchers dried them into leathery slices that lasted years in sealed tins and rehydrated into pie filling during winter months when fresh fruit was memory. Drying peaches required slicing them thin, spreading them on screens in hot sun, covering them with cheesecloth to prevent flies, and waiting days until moisture evaporated completely. The dried slices shriveled and darkened, but retained intense peach flavor that bloomed when soaked in water overnight before cooking into pie filling. Making dried peach pie meant rehydrating fruit, cooking it with sugar until soft, thickening with cornstarch, and baking in lard crusts that complemented sweet filling perfectly. The pies tasted remarkably similar to fresh peach versions, and nobody complained when winter pies came from summer's dried harvest. Each pie cost almost nothing because ranchers dried their own fruit, and 1 bushel of fresh peaches produced enough dried fruit for dozens of winter pies. By 1960, frozen and canned peaches replaced dried versions, and the drying tradition died. Airy Hook 10 Forgotten Desserts revealed, 20 more hiding in pioneer trunks and cattle drive journals. Number 13 Bubbles and grunts while cooking. Number 17 transforms stale biscuits into pudding. Number 20 crosses the ocean from England. Cowboys rode miles for these, and modern bakers forgot they ever existed at all. Cobbler service berries appeared in early summer before any other wild fruit ripened, and ranchers considered them gifts from Providence. When food supplies ran low, cowboys working spring roundups requested serviceberry cobbler when berries ripened, and cooks obliged because ingredients cost almost nothing and preparation took minimal time. Each cobbler fed a dozen hungry ranch hands and cost only flour, lard, and sugar because berries were free for the picking. By 1970, fewer people recognized serviceberry shrubs, and the tradition of picking first fruits died when supermarkets provided year-round berry access that eliminated waiting for seasonal wild harvests and made patience unnecessary in food acquisition. Winter meant no fresh fruit whatsoever, so ranchers made cobblers from dried apples, peaches, apricots, and pears that rehydrated into filling almost as good as fresh versions when soaked overnight and cooked with sugar. The dried fruit came from summer and autumn harvests, when ranchers dried every perishable fruit they could find, storing leathery slices in sealed tins that lasted years without spoiling or losing flavor. Ranch wives kept dozens of tins stacked in pantries specifically for winter desserts when fresh options didn't exist, and dried fruit meant the difference between dessert and no dessert. Making cobbler required soaking dried fruit in water overnight until it plumped back to nearly fresh texture, cooking it with sugar until soft and syrupy, pouring it into baking dishes, topping with biscuit dough or pie crust scraps, then baking until tops browned and fruit filling bubbled. The cobbler tasted remarkably similar to fresh fruit versions, and cowboys eating it in January forgot temporarily that snow covered the ground outside and fresh fruit wouldn't return for months. Children loved dried fruit cobbler because the concentrated fruit flavor tasted sweeter and more intense than fresh versions. Each cobbler cost pennies because ranchers dried their own fruit, and one tin of dried fruit produced multiple cobblers throughout winter. Ranch families ate dried fruit cobbler weekly from November through March, and the dessert became associated with survival through brutal prairie winters. High mountain huckleberries grew in remote areas requiring horseback trips to access, but ranchers made the journey willingly because huckleberries tasted better than any cultivated berry and made grunt that cowboys remembered decades later. The name came from sounds the dessert made while cooking, bubbling and grunting as berry juices simmered beneath dumpling topping that steamed rather than baked. Mountain families picked huckleberries during late summer camping trips, filling buckets with tiny dark berries that stained everything purple and tasted intensely of wild fruit that couldn't be replicated by domestic varieties. Making grunt meant cooking fresh huckleberries with sugar in cast-iron skillets over campfires or wood stoves, dropping biscuit dough by spoonfuls on top of bubbling berries, covering everything with tight-fitting lids, then letting steam cook dumplings until fluffy, while berry filling thickened underneath. The dessert was eaten warm, with dumplings soaking up purple juice and providing contrast to intense berry flavor beneath. Ranch families who lived near mountains made huckleberry grunt annually during berry season, and children fought over who got the most dumpling-soaked portions. Cowboys working summer ranges requested it when huckleberries ripened, and the dessert became associated with mountain camps and cool evenings after hot days. Each grunt cost almost nothing, because berries were free and dumpling topping required only flour, lard, and baking powder. The effort of reaching remote berry patches made grunt feel more special than desserts made from accessible ingredients. By 1975, fewer families made mountain berry trips, and huckleberry grunt became something only elderly ranchers remembered eating during childhood spent following parents into high country. Slump got its name from how biscuit topping slumped into berry filling during cooking, creating a rustic dessert that looked messy but tasted better than prettiest pies ever made in ranch kitchens. The dessert was similar to grunt, but cooked differently, with dough dropped onto simmering berries that were then covered and cooked slowly until dumplings absorbed juice and became purple throughout, instead of staying white inside. Ranchers made slump from whatever wild berries they found, mixing blackberries, raspberries, serviceberries, and elderberries together when single berry quantities weren't sufficient for full desserts. The combination created complex flavors that changed with every batch depending on berry ratios and ripeness levels. Making slump required cooking mixed berries with sugar until bubbling, dropping biscuit dough across the surface, covering tightly, then simmering slowly until dumplings cooked through and berry sauce thickened into syrup that stained everything it touched. Ranch families ate slump warm from the pot, spooning purple portions into bowls and adding cream when dairy was available. The dessert was purely functional rather than decorative, designed to feed maximum people with minimum ingredients and zero concern for presentation. Cowboys didn't care how slump looked because taste mattered more than appearance, and ranch cooks appreciated desserts that required no fancy techniques or special equipment beyond pots and spoons. Each slump cost pennies because wild berries were free and dumpling topping was cheap, making it affordable dessert for large families and hired help. By 1980, mixed berry desserts disappeared as people demanded single berry purity, and the tradition of combining whatever berries existed died with practical cooking. Ranch kitchens often lacked proper ovens, so cooks made cakes in cast-iron skillets over stovetops or campfires, creating dense sweet cakes that sliced into wedges and satisfied dessert needs without requiring baking expertise. The cakes weren't light and fluffy like oven versions because skillet heat came from below only, creating browned bottoms and barely cooked tops that required flipping midway through cooking to achieve even doneness. Ranchers didn't care about cake texture when options were skillet cake or no cake, and the dense crumb actually held up better during transport than delicate layer cakes that crumbled. Making skillet cake meant mixing flour, sugar, eggs, milk, and melted lard into thick batter that poured into greased hot skillets, cooked covered over low heat until bottoms browned, then got flipped carefully to cook tops without burning already cooked sides. The process required attention and skill, but experienced cooks produced remarkably good cakes using only skillets and stovetops. Ranch families ate skillet cake plain or topped with molasses, wild berry preserves, or canned milk mixed with sugar. Cowboys requested it during cattle drives, when proper baking was impossible, but dessert remained necessary for morale. Each cake cost 15 cents and fed 6 to 8 people depending on how generously portions were cut. The cakes lasted for days without spoiling, making them practical trail food that provided sweetness during weeks of eating nothing but beans and hardtack. 15 ranch desserts down, 15 more waiting. Number 17 used only bread scraps. Number 20 required no eggs. This was frontier survival baking. Every ranch kitchen kept sourdough starter alive, and when birthdays or celebrations required cake, sourdough provided leavening because yeast and baking powder were expensive luxuries that ran out between town trips lasting weeks. The cakes tasted distinctly tangy from sourdough fermentation, creating flavor complexity that plain cakes lacked and that some people preferred over neutral sweetness. Ranch wives mixed sourdough starter with flour, sugar, eggs when available, melted lard, and molasses or sugar into thick batter that required overnight rising before baking in Dutch ovens or wood-fired ovens. The long fermentation made cakes remarkably tender, despite using rough ingredients and primitive equipment. Sourdough cake wasn't light like modern cakes because dense crumb was expected and preferred for its ability to satisfy hunger better than airy versions. Ranch families ate sourdough cake plain or frosted, with boiled icing, made from sugar and water, beaten until fluffy. Cowboys received sourdough cake on their birthdays, And the gesture mattered more than cake quality, because any cake on cattle drives felt like luxury. The cakes lasted for days without drying out, because sourdough retained moisture better than other cakes, making them practical for storage without refrigeration. Each cake cost pennies because starter was free, flour was cheap, and eggs came from ranch chickens. Ranch children grew up expecting sourdough tang in all cakes, and they found store-bought cakes bland and boring by comparison. By 1955, packaged cake mixes replaced sourdough baking in most ranch kitchens. Leftover biscuits never went to waste on ranches where throwing away food was unthinkable sin, so cooks transformed stale biscuits into pudding that cowboys loved more than fresh biscuits themselves. The pudding was simple Desperation dessert made by breaking dried biscuits into pieces, soaking them in milk or water until soft, mixing in eggs, sugar, raisins, or dried fruit when available, then baking everything until it set into custardy pudding with crispy top. Ranch families made biscuit pudding multiple times weekly because biscuits were daily staples that hardened within hours in dry prairie air, and pudding rescued them from becoming inedible rocks. The dessert tasted rich, despite humble origins, because soaked biscuits absorbed custard completely, and baking caramelized sugar into sweet crust that contrasted with soft interior. Children loved biscuit pudding more than fresh biscuits, because pudding meant sweetness and fruit, while biscuits meant just bread. Cowboys ate it warm for breakfast or dessert, depending on when Cookie made it, and nobody questioned pudding appearing at odd times because ranch meal schedules were flexible. Each pudding cost almost nothing because it used food that would otherwise be wasted, and the only additions were milk, eggs, and sugar that ranches produced themselves. Some cooks added whiskey or vanilla when available, creating adult versions that made evening meals more tolerable after brutal workdays. The pudding kept ranch economies running by eliminating waste, and families took pride in never throwing away edible food. By 1965, commercial bread stayed soft longer than homemade biscuits, and biscuit pudding became unnecessary when waste was acceptable, and nobody remembered that Depression thinking persisted. Bread pudding on ranches differed from city versions because prairie isolation meant using whatever bread existed, whether that was sourdough, cornbread, biscuits, or combinations of all three, mixed together into pudding that tasted different every time. The flexibility made bread pudding perfect ranch dessert because it adapted to available ingredients and never required specific bread types that might not exist during weeks between town trips. Ranch wives saved every bread scrap in covered crocks, and when enough accumulated, they made pudding by soaking bread in milk or water until mushy, beating in eggs, sugar, dried fruit, spices, and melted lard, then baking everything until set and browned. The resulting pudding was dense, sweet, filling, and completely satisfying despite being made from scraps. Cowboys requested bread pudding regularly because it reminded them of home cooking even when eaten from tin plates beside campfires. The pudding was served warm, cold, or room temperature depending on weather and preference, and it tasted good regardless of temperature. Ranch families ate bread pudding for breakfast, topped with cream or molasses, for dessert after supper, or as afternoon snacks when hunger struck between meals. Each pudding cost pennies because it used food scraps, and the only purchased ingredients were sugar and maybe raisins. Some cooks added whiskey or brandy, creating adult versions that warmed cold evenings after winter chores. The pudding represented frontier resourcefulness at its finest, transforming waste into desirable food that people actively wanted eating. By 1970, bread stayed fresh longer, and throwing away stale bread became acceptable, and bread pudding became old-fashioned dessert nobody made anymore unless trying to recreate grandmother's recipes. Cornmeal cost less than wheat flour and kept longer without spoiling, so ranchers made pudding from cornmeal when wheat flour ran low, and dessert still needed happening somehow. The pudding was similar to Italian polenta, but sweetened with molasses or sugar, and enriched with milk and eggs when dairy and chickens were producing. Making it required cooking cornmeal in milk or water until thick like porridge, stirring constantly to prevent burning and lumping, then mixing in sweetener, eggs, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, and baking everything until it set into firm pudding that sliced into squares. The texture was grainy and dense, nothing like smooth wheat puddings, but the corn flavor was pleasant and the sweetness satisfied. Ranch families ate cornmeal pudding, warm or cold, plain or topped with cream, molasses, or wild berry preserves when available. Cowboys tolerated it without enthusiasm, because cornmeal meant economy rather than preference, but they ate it anyway, because dessert was dessert regardless of grain source. The pudding kept for days without refrigeration, making it practical ranch food that could be made ahead and eaten throughout the week. Each pudding cost pennies because cornmeal was cheaper than flour, and the other ingredients came from ranch production. Some families added dried fruit or nuts when available, improving pudding and making it feel less economical. Ranch children grew up eating cornmeal pudding regularly and associated the taste with prairie childhoods. By 1960, cornmeal pudding disappeared as wheat flour became affordable and nobody wanted grainy desserts when smooth options existed, and the pudding became symbol of poverty rather than practical economy. English and Scottish ranchers brought sugar biscuit recipes from home countries, and the simple cookies became ranch favorites because they required only flour, butter or lard, sugar, and eggs, without needing exotic spices or flavorings impossible to obtain on isolated ranches. The cookies weren't American biscuits that were fluffy and savory, but rather British biscuits, meaning cookies that were crisp and sweet. Making them required creaming fat with sugar, adding eggs and flour, rolling dough thin, cutting rounds with cups or biscuit cutters, then baking until barely golden and crisp. The cookies were plain by design, meant to showcase butter quality rather than mask inferior ingredients with spices, but ranch versions used lard instead of expensive butter and tasted just as good. Ranch wives made sugar biscuits weekly because they kept for weeks in tins without softening or losing flavor, providing reliable cookies for unexpected guests, and afternoon tea that English families maintained despite living on American prairies. Cowboys ate sugar biscuits dunked in coffee during morning and afternoon breaks, and the simple sweetness satisfied without overwhelming. Children loved them because they weren't too sweet or too spiced, just pleasantly cookie-like and familiar. Each batch produced dozens of cookies costing only pennies, and the recipe was foolproof enough that young daughters learned cookie making by preparing sugar biscuits. 20 desserts revealed, 10 more hidden. Number 23 used wild flowers. Number 27 cost nothing. Number 30. Nobody recognized anymore. German ranchers brought Lebkuchen recipes from Bavaria and adapted them to frontier conditions, where imported spices were rare and expensive luxuries that arrived only during annual town trips. The cookies were traditional Christmas treats in Germany, but became year-round staples on American ranches because the dense spice cookies lasted for months without spoiling and provided sweetness during long winters when fresh desserts were impossible. Making Lebkuchen required mixing honey or molasses with brown sugar, flour, eggs, and whatever spices existed in pantries, including cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and black pepper, that created complex flavor no single spice could achieve. The dough rested overnight, allowing flavors to develop and meld together, then got rolled thin, cut into shapes, and baked until firm and aromatic. Ranch versions were simpler than German originals because candied citrus peel and elaborate decorations weren't available, but the essential spice cookie character remained intact. German families made Lebkuchen during autumn after harvest, when molasses and honey were abundant, and winter preparations began. The cookies were stored in tins where they softened slightly and flavors intensified over weeks and months. Children received Lebkuchen in Christmas stockings along with nuts and dried fruit, and the cookies represented connection to homeland left behind. Cowboys of German descent requested Lebkuchen constantly, and non-German ranch hands developed taste for the unusual spice combinations that distinguished them from American cookies. Each batch cost pennies despite seeming exotic, because spices were purchased once yearly in bulk and lasted through multiple baking sessions. The cookies traveled well without crumbling, making them ideal for sending to relatives in distant towns or giving to cowboys heading out on cattle drives lasting weeks. Ranch wives traded Lebkuchen with neighbors who made different ethnic cookies, creating informal cookie exchanges that introduced German traditions to Irish, English, and Scandinavian families. Winter storms that dumped feet of clean snow created opportunities for molasses snow candy that ranch children anticipated more eagerly than Christmas itself. The candy was made by boiling molasses until it reached soft crack stage, then pouring hot syrup in ribbons across fresh snow, where it instantly hardened into chewy, taffy-like strips that children grabbed with cold hands and ate immediately. Making snow candy was event rather than recipe because it required perfect snow conditions, patient molasses boiling, and audience of excited children waiting to grab candy the moment it hardened. Ranch mothers made snow candy during blizzards, when children were trapped indoors and cabin fever threatened everyone's sanity. The activity occupied children for hours as they begged for more candy, played in snow, and returned inside to warm up before repeating the cycle. The candy cost almost nothing because molasses was pantry staple and snow was free, making it perfect entertainment and dessert combined. Each batch of boiled molasses produced dozens of candy ribbons depending on how generously the cook poured and how thinly she drizzled syrup across snow. Children competed over who got longest ribbons and whose candy looked best, and mothers judged contests to prevent fighting. Cowboys working winter ranges missed snow candy parties happening at ranch houses, but they made their own versions during blizzards by boiling molasses over campfires and pouring it onto clean snowbanks. The candy was eaten immediately because it didn't keep well once removed from snow, and the ephemeral nature made it more special than candies that stored indefinitely. Ranch families from snowy regions made snow candy annually, and the tradition became associated with winter storms that isolated ranches for days and required creative entertainment for restless children. Some families added butter or vinegar to molasses before boiling, creating slightly different textures and flavors that became family signatures. Wild grapevines produced small, intensely flavored grapes that ranchers couldn't eat fresh because of overwhelming tartness, but cooking them into fruit leather created chewy candy that cowboys carried in saddlebags and children hoarded like treasure. Making grape leather required cooking wild grapes until soft, pressing them through sieves to remove seeds and skins, mixing pulp with sugar or honey, then spreading mixture paper thin on greased pans or oiled cloth, and drying it in sun for days until it became pliable leather that peeled off in sheets. The process took nearly a week because grape pulp dried slowly and required bringing indoors every evening to prevent dew from rehydrating it overnight. Ranch wives made grape leather during autumn, when wild grapes ripened and drying weather was reliable, producing enough leather to last through winter and into following spring. The finished leather was rolled into logs, wrapped in cloth, and stored in cool, dry places where it kept indefinitely without spoiling or losing flavor. Children received grape leather as treats and rewards, and they traded pieces like currency during school recesses. Cowboys carried grape leather during cattle drives because it provided quick energy, satisfied sweet cravings, and weighed almost nothing in already overloaded saddlebags. The intense grape flavor meant small pieces satisfied, where larger amounts of other candies wouldn't, making it economical despite labor-intensive preparation. Each batch cost only sugar because grapes were free, and one picking session produced enough grapes for multiple batches of leather that fed families for months. Ranch families picked wild grapes together, making it social activity that connected generations and created memories alongside actual product. Some families added other wild fruits to grape leather, creating unique blends that became family specialties, traded with neighbors. The leather never went to waste because it lasted forever, and everyone wanted it, making it valuable commodity in barter economies that dominated rural areas. By 1975, wild grapevines got cleared during land improvements and fence construction, and nobody picked wild grapes anymore when stores sold cultivated grapes year-round and fruit leather became specialty item rather than necessity, and the tradition of spending week making leather died with generation that remembered when homemade candy was only candy available. Dried cherries rehydrated into plump fruit that ranchers dipped in batter and fried into fritters that satisfied donut cravings when yeast and time for proper donut making didn't exist. The fritters were quick desperation dessert made by soaking dried cherries in water until soft, dipping them in simple flour batter, and frying them in hot lard until golden and crispy outside while remaining soft and fruity inside. Ranch cooks made cherry fritters when cowboys requested something sweet, but time didn't allow for elaborate baking that required hours of preparation and careful attention. Making them took 20 minutes from start to finish, and the results satisfied better than cookies or simple cakes that required more effort. Each dried cherry became individual fritter, making portion control easy and allowing people to eat as many or few as desired without cutting or serving complications. The fritters were eaten hot from frying pans, rolled in sugar while still greasy, and devoured immediately because they hardened and became less appealing as they cooled. Ranch families made cherry fritters on washing days or other busy days when regular meals were impossible but people still needed feeding. Cowboys, working spring branding, received cherry fritters as mid-morning snacks that provided energy without requiring stopping work for formal meals. Children loved fritters because eating them meant permission to get messy and sticky without scolding. Each batch cost pennies because dried cherries were cheap and batter required only flour, eggs, and milk that ranches produced themselves. The frying process used lard saved from breakfast bacon, eliminating need to purchase special frying fats. Some cooks added cinnamon or nutmeg to batter, creating spiced versions that complemented cherry sweetness perfectly. The fritters never lasted long enough to store because everyone ate them immediately, fighting over last few pieces until pan was empty. Ranch wives appreciated fritters because they used minimal dishes and cleanup was simple compared to elaborate desserts requiring multiple pans and complicated processes. By 1960, dried cherries became specialty items rather than pantry staples, and cherry fritters disappeared as younger generations preferred donuts from bakeries over homemade fried desserts that required hot lard and careful attention to prevent burning and grease fires that threatened wooden ranch houses. Elderflower blooms appeared in late spring covering bushes with creamy white flowers that smelled sweet and delicate, and ranchers dipped entire flower clusters in batter and fried them into fritters that tasted like eating spring itself. The fritters were unusual dessert that required perfect timing because elderflowers bloomed for only 2 weeks annually, and ranchers had to harvest them before petals dropped and opportunity passed for another year. Making elderflower fritters meant picking flower clusters early morning when dew still clung to petals, shaking off insects, dipping clusters in thin pancake-like batter that coated flowers without overwhelming delicate flavor, then frying quickly in hot lard until batter crisped and flowers softened. The resulting fritters were eaten immediately while hot, dusted with sugar, and devoured before they cooled and lost their magic. Ranch families made elderflower fritters only once or twice per year during brief blooming period, creating anticipation and excitement that made them more special than desserts available year-round. Children helped pick flowers, and the activity became spring tradition marking end of winter and beginning of growing season. Cowboys working calving season received elderflower fritters as special treats that broke monotony of beans and biscuits dominating cattle camp meals. The fritters tasted floral and slightly sweet, with hint of honey that came from flower nectar rather than added sugar. Each batch cost almost nothing because flowers were free and batter was cheap, but the limited availability made them feel luxurious despite humble origins. Ranch wives competed over whose elderflower fritters were lightest and most delicate, and recipes were guarded secrets passed down through female family lines. Some cooks added lemon zest or vanilla to batter-enhancing but not overwhelming flour flavor. The fritters represented connection to nature and seasons that modern life eliminates through year-round availability of everything. Ranch families marked calendar awaiting elderflower bloom, and missing it meant waiting entire year for another chance. By 1970, fewer people recognized elderberry bushes or knew flowers were edible, and elderflower fritters became completely forgotten dessert that only elderly ranchers remembered eating during childhoods when seasonal food was only food and waiting for ingredients to ripen was normal rather than inconvenient, and patience was required rather than optional. 25 pioneer desserts uncovered, 5 final recipes waiting. Number 27 pulls molasses into golden taffy. Number 28 makes pie from crackers. Number 29 creates cake from wild fruit preserves. Number 30 disguises plants as lemon. These were the strangest ranch desserts nobody makes anymore. English ranchers missed traditional desserts from home and created gooseberry fool using wild American gooseberries that grew along fence lines and creek banks across prairie ranches. The dessert was simple combination of cooked, sweetened gooseberries folded into whipped cream, creating pink striped dessert that looked fancy despite requiring minimal ingredients and effort. Making fool required cooking tart gooseberries with sugar until they burst and released juice, cooling the mixture completely, then folding it gently into whipped cream that came from ranch dairy cows producing more milk than families could consume. The name fool came from French word meaning crushed or pressed, referring to cooked fruit rather than implying stupidity, but ranch children found the name hilarious and requested fool specifically because of amusing title. Ranch wives made gooseberry fool during summer, when gooseberries ripened and cream was abundant from cows eating rich pasture grass. The dessert was served in glass dishes when available, or simple bowls when fancy serving pieces didn't exist on remote ranches. Cowboys raised on American desserts found fool strange and suspicious, but English and Scottish ranch hands loved it as reminder of home left behind. The pink and white stripes created visual appeal that elevated fool beyond its simple ingredients, and guests were impressed by dessert that looked complicated despite being easy. Each batch cost pennies because gooseberries were free and cream came from ranch production, making it economical dessert that appeared expensive and sophisticated. Children loved fool because it was sweet, creamy, and cold during hot summer days, before refrigeration made cold desserts common. Ranch families served gooseberry fool at summer gatherings and celebrations, and the dessert became associated with warm weather and abundance after harsh winters. Some cooks added vanilla or lemon to enhance flavor, but purists insisted fool should taste only of gooseberries and cream without interference. The dessert didn't keep well because cream spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so fool was eaten same day it was made, creating urgency that made it more special. Ranch wives timed fool making to coincide with important events, ensuring fresh dessert for celebrations. By 1965, fewer ranches kept dairy cows as store-bought milk became convenient, and gooseberry fool disappeared as wild gooseberries went unpicked and cream became expensive luxury rather than surplus byproduct of ranch life. And younger generations never experienced fool or understood why anyone named dessert after insult. Layer cakes were special occasion desserts on ranches, and filling them with choke cherry jelly made them memorable, despite using simple yellow cake layers that anyone could bake. The cake was pioneer version of elegant jelly roll, using wild fruit preserves between layers, instead of expensive imported jams that cost too much and weren't available in remote areas anyway. Making jelly cake required baking 2 or 3 thin cake layers in Dutch ovens or wood-fired ovens, cooling them completely, then spreading thick layers of choke cherry jelly between each cake layer and stacking them into impressive tower. The jelly soaked into cake slightly, creating moist, tender crumb that contrasted with intense tart-sweet jelly flavor between layers. Ranch wives made choke cherry jelly every August when berries ripened, putting up dozens of jars that lasted through winter and into following summer. The jelly was deep purple, intensely flavored, and perfect for cakes because its tartness balanced sweet cake layers. Birthday celebrations featured jelly cake because it felt special, despite using everyday ingredients that cost almost nothing. Cowboys requested jelly cake for holidays and special occasions, and the dessert became associated with celebrations rather than ordinary meals. Each cake fed 8 to 10 people depending on how generously slices were cut, and every bite contained cake and jelly together, creating perfect balance. Children loved jelly cake because jelly was candy-like, and cake was treat, and combination was better than either alone. Ranch families made jelly cake for visiting relatives, church socials, and community gatherings where impressive desserts were expected. The cake was frosted simply with boiled icing or left unfrosted, allowing purple jelly to show through, creating rustic appeal. Some bakers added lemon zest to cake batter, enhancing but not overwhelming choke cherry flavor. The cake kept for days without refrigeration because sugar in jelly acted as preservative, preventing spoilage. Ranch wives took pride in their jelly cakes, and recipes varied slightly between families, creating subtle differences that locals recognized immediately. By 1970, commercial jelly replaced homemade versions, and jelly cake became old-fashioned dessert nobody made because picking wild choke cherries, cooking jelly, and baking cake layers required too much effort when bakery cakes were available in town stores, and younger generations preferred chocolate frosting over fruit preserves and found jelly cake disappointingly plain. Wild plum trees grew along creek bottoms, producing small tart fruit that ranchers transformed into jam that was then baked into spice cakes that tasted like autumn and abundance. The cake was dark, dense, and moist, from jam mixed directly into batter rather than spread between layers, creating fruit cake that didn't require expensive dried fruits and nuts, impossible to obtain on isolated ranches. Making jam cake required creaming lard with brown sugar, adding eggs and wild plum jam, then mixing in flour, spices including cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and allspice, and baking slowly until cake set and developed deep mahogany color. The jam added moisture and fruit flavor that intensified as cake aged, and the dessert actually tasted better after several days than fresh from oven. Ranch families made wild plum jam cake during autumn, after making jam from summer plum harvest that produced more fruit than families could eat fresh. The cake was served at Thanksgiving and Christmas alongside other special desserts, and its dark color and rich flavor made it feel festive and celebratory. Cowboys working fall roundup received jam cake as special treat, and the dessert reminded them of harvest abundance during weeks of eating simple trail food. Each cake cost pennies because jam was made from free wild fruit, and other ingredients were pantry staples. Children loved jam cake because it was sweet, spicy, and different from plain cakes that dominated everyday desserts. Ranch wives wrapped jam cakes in cloth and stored them in cool places where they kept for weeks without spoiling or drying out. Some bakers added raisins or chopped nuts when available, creating even richer versions that approached traditional fruit cake. The cake traveled well without crumbling, making it a practical gift for neighbors and relatives living on distant ranches. Saltine crackers crushed and mixed with sugar created pie filling that tasted mysteriously like apple pie despite containing 0 apples, and ranchers served it to guests who couldn't identify ingredients and assumed they were eating real fruit. The pie was ultimate desperation dessert, invented during times when fresh fruit, dried fruit, and canned fruit were all unavailable, but pie was still expected at meals. Making soda cracker pie required crushing saltines into fine crumbs, mixing them with sugar, vanilla, cream of tartar or vinegar, and egg whites beaten stiff, then baking everything in pie shell until set and slightly browned. The chemistry created texture and flavor remarkably similar to apple pie, and people eating it without knowing ingredients insisted it contained real apples. Ranch wives served soda cracker pie when unexpected guests arrived, and pantries contained nothing suitable for proper dessert. The pie cost pennies because crackers were cheap pantry staples, and other ingredients were basic baking supplies every ranch kitchen maintained. Cowboys eating soda cracker pie debated ingredients endlessly, and some never believed they weren't eating real fruit even after being told exact recipe. The deception amused ranch cooks who took pride in fooling people with humble ingredients, and soda cracker pie became conversation piece at community gatherings. Each pie fed 6 to 8 people. Sheep sorrel grew wild across pastures, and ranchers picked the tangy, lemony leaves to make pies that tasted remarkably similar to lemon meringue despite containing no citrus fruit whatsoever. The pie was last resort dessert, created when lemons were impossible to obtain due to distance from towns and lack of refrigerated transport that would allow citrus to survive journey from California to prairie ranches. Making sheep sorrel pie required picking young tender sorrel leaves before they became too tough and bitter, chopping them fine, mixing with sugar and eggs, cooking mixture until thick, pouring into baked pie shell, and topping with meringue made from leftover egg whites. The sorrel provided intense sour flavor that mimicked lemon perfectly, and people eating pie without knowing ingredients assumed they were tasting real citrus. Ranch wives picked sheep sorrel during spring when leaves were most tender and lemon flavor was strongest before summer heat made plants tough and unpalatable. The pie cost nothing because sorrel grew wild everywhere, and other ingredients were basic supplies, making it free dessert that tasted expensive and sophisticated. Cowboys eating sheep sorrel pie marveled at finding lemon pie on remote ranches where lemons never appeared, and they praised cooks for obtaining impossible ingredients. The deception pleased ranch cooks who understood that good cooking meant using whatever nature provided rather than depending on distant suppliers. Each pie fed 6 people, and the meringue topping made it look elegant, despite humble origins that involved picking weeds from pastures. Between 1850 and 1950, 30 rancher desserts disappeared as frontier life ended and modern convenience replaced pioneer resourcefulness. Bear sign, sourdough donuts, molasses candy. These weren't fancy bakery creations requiring imported ingredients and trained pastry chefs. They were survival desserts made from lard, molasses, wild berries, and whatever flour remained in barrels after long winters. Cowboys rode 20 miles for bear sign, fresh from Dutch ovens. Ranch families picked wild berries for days, making enough preserves to last through brutal winters. Children pulled molasses candy until arms ached and taffy turned golden. Then everything changed. Bakeries opened in towns selling perfect donuts that required no effort. Supermarkets stocked candy that eliminated hours of pulling and cooking. Frozen desserts replaced wild berry cobblers that demanded picking fruit in remote mountains. The shortcuts that saved exhausted ranch families became embarrassments nobody admitted using.